During Microsoft's E3 2005 press conference, Square Enix announced a port of Final Fantasy XI to Xbox 360, in addition to presenting a tech demo to christen the beginning of the Japanese publisher's relationship with Microsoft's console business. This demo partially served as a springboard for development on Square Enix's second Final Fantasy MMO, which became Final Fantasy XIV, and went on to release in 2010 to a reception so dire that the entire game was rebuilt from scratch and re-released as version 2.0, A Realm Reborn, in 2013. And now, nearly 19 years after that 2005 Microsoft press conference, Xbox Series X and S owners are finally invited to the adventure alongside players on Windows, Mac, PS4, PS4 Pro, and PS5. Quite why it took so long for FF14 to come to Xbox consoles is lost on me, because one of Square Enix's core unshakable MMO tenets, from Final Fantasy to Dragon Quest, has always been to have players on all platforms play together on the same servers, even at times when cross-platform multiplayer was otherwise verboten. So the long wait is unfortunate, but now there are even more places where people can choose to play the award-winning MMO with the outrageously generous and ever-expanding free trial that covers multiple RPGs worth of engaging stories that friends have been pestering friends to try for years. But quite how good this version is, well, it has its ups and downs, and a game like this has a lot of angles to consider.
Peter Spencer!
However, Final Fantasy XIV's long-awaited arrival on Xbox Series consoles comes at a rather strange time. You see, the game's overall graphical features and presentation have remained largely unchanged since version 2.0 in 2013. While the discontinuation of the PlayStation 3 version alongside the launch of version 4.0 and the Stormblood expansion in 2017 gave designers a bit more freedom in creating new regions and gameplay content, Final Fantasy XIV very much maintains the look of a 2013 cross-gen title, albeit one that I would argue continues to look striking thanks to its art direction. So it's no surprise that the game's much-hyped graphics update is one of the most anticipated features of the upcoming version 7.0. Perhaps as much as the Dawntrail expansion itself, which Square Enix has slated for release this July, with early access beginning June 28th. A PC benchmark for Dawntrail was just released, but considering it focuses on new locations, direct comparisons to existing content are impossible, although it does offer a glimpse of things like the much improved foliage system. I'm looking forward to building my own comparisons to see how the upscaling, expanded lighting, and revamped materials work out, but producer-director Naoki Yoshida has strongly emphasized that expectations should be kept in check. Final Fantasy XVI, this is not. After all, if the underlying technology were to truly be seriously reworked, then there would be no reason to release the Xbox editions ahead of version 7.0, and yet, here we are. So on one hand, you might ask, why bother testing on Xbox today if it's going to change so soon anyway? Well, while we do know a lot thanks to various presentations and the Dawntrail benchmark on PC, until the graphics update goes live, we can't fully know the extent to which certain features will apply across the various console versions. For instance, we already know that some features, but not necessarily which features, will apply limitedly to PS4 and Series S. Some new features on PC, PS5, and Series X may be optional, while many vestiges of the 2.0 game may disappear forever. So I see this as an opportunity to preserve some aspect of a thing that seems set to become impossible to capture again in only a few months' time. After all, I've long regretted that I never recorded anything of the PS2 version of Final Fantasy XI, and that I never had the opportunity to play the Xbox 360 version before they were taken out of service. So I think it's a valuable exercise to look at these Xbox versions as they are in this brief window that they exist in this way, and then revisit the whole endeavor again in some months' time to see how the graphics update shakes out. One last snapshot of the game as it has been. After all, how can we judge the graphics update if we don't first look at where we started? But before we get into the meat of the Xbox ports, I think it's important to give a quick update on the PlayStation 5 version, since it's our primary point of comparison, and because optimizations for all versions have implications for Xbox too. And the last time I covered FF14 here on Digital Foundry, there were some baffling performance issues on PS5, which then lingered in the code for a good long time after. If you recall, the native PS5 version released in 2021 would run at 60 frames per second most of the time when using the in-game 1440p setting. But semi-frequent frame rate dips during world traversal were rather distracting and would occur in even very simple locations for no outwardly discernible reason. These drops could be easily reproduced in specific locations by pointing the camera in the offending direction and would occur regardless of weather, time of day, number of players, or even if the rendering resolution were set all the way down to 1080p. Most curiously of all, running the PS4 version on PS5 under backwards compatibility set to 1440p would perform flawlessly in these same scenarios despite being identical to the PS5 version in terms of visible graphics parameters. Version 6.0 and the Endwalker expansion came with no fixes for PS5, and while version 6.1 added a level of detail toggle to the console versions, it failed to address the problem. It wasn't until version 6.2 in August 2022 that the PS5's woes were suddenly no more, presumably thanks to what the patch notes call graphics processing optimization. Now the native PS5 version can be fully recommended without hesitation, with a firm hold on 60 FPS throughout world traversal and battle content when the resolution is set to 1440p. Now frame drops only occur at 1440p with a clear cause, such as an extreme number of players or excessive alpha effects. The optimizations weren't just clearing up unexplained stutters though. The PS5's native 2160p mode could absolutely not be recommended prior to patch 6.2, and I would argue that the 1440p mode still remains far preferable. But where we typically saw frame rates in the low 30s to mid 40s in 4K, we can now often achieve something dramatically higher. Values that can, in theory, be workable within the PS5's rather narrow, by-the-books variable refresh rate range. It's also not quite as much of a challenge as it was before to find spots on PS5 where 60 FPS can be hit while rendering at 2160p, fleeting as it may be. But in practice, we're often hovering so close to that 48 FPS VRR limit and below that the frames regularly fall back into the 60Hz container and judder resumes. Nonetheless, it's clear that whatever bottlenecks have been addressed, a measurable performance uplift when rendering at native 2160p has manifested, often of the order of 10 more frames per second or thereabouts. Just for good measure, I'll quickly note that the PS4 version has also benefited. The difference is small when using the normal draw quality setting, but what's nice is that the high draw quality setting, which used to tank performance heavily on PS4, can now be used with a minimal hit, allowing you to enjoy certain visual features like parallax occlusion maps. It remains difficult, but is perhaps more common now to hit 60 FPS on base PS4. So judder is still a near constant reality. It was never ideal, and it still isn't, but it's still nice to see improvements to the PS4 version after all this time, even if I am doubtful that it'll make the cut for the expansion after Dawn Trail. It's a shame that we never could see the game running on the PS4's contemporary Xbox One platform. When using 1080p on PS4 Pro, isolated but extended periods of 60 FPS seem to be a lot more attainable outside of towns than they used to be, but in towns, the difference of before and after patch 6.2 is much less noticeable. 1080p over 1440p is still very much the way to go on PS4 Pro. Version 6.2 also introduced a rather suspect dynamic resolution setting, but we'll get into that a bit later. It's likely, of course, that the PC version also benefited from the so-called graphics processing optimization in version 6.2, but since we didn't capture any data from the PC version previously, we can't say for sure. Today, the game is just a bit beyond version 6.55, which was the last main story content patch before the Dawn Trail expansion. So, with the PS4 versions being a bit improved and the PS5 version in the state it should have launched in, the stage is now set for the long-awaited Xbox version. Keep in mind that lighting and other players present in comparison shots will, of course, inevitably vary a bit since it's usually not possible to record more than one version at a time, and the game days and weather patterns are always marching forward on server time. But predictably, on Xbox Series X, the preset console graphics parameters and available settings match what's on PlayStation 5. You can choose a rendering resolution of 1080p, 1440p, or 2160p with lightweight anti-aliasing provided by FXAA, a relic of the game's 2013 vintage, which is still the only anti-aliasing option in the PC version as well. However, FSR1 and DLSS 2.0 were just confirmed for the graphics update. In the Dawn Trail benchmark, FXAA remains an option when using FSR alongside new TSC-MAA settings, but it's unclear what combination of techniques will be in the 7.0 console versions. So if you're the sort who can't abide by any temporal image treatment, drink deep of the FXAA while you still can. Meanwhile, Xbox Series S only offers 1080p and 1440p, with 2160p noted as being only for the Series X. At 1440p, Series S looks identical to Series X, and by extension, PlayStation 5 and PS4 Pro if each version is set to that resolution. I have never been able to identify any discrepancies in texture, shadow quality, or level of detail in any console version to date when configured with their best settings where applicable, aside from the PS3 version of course, which I personally never had the pleasure of playing. In all seriousness, I do wish I'd experienced it. The only visual thing to note on the Xbox side is that the Series S does not receive the game's 4K quality 2D assets that arrived on PC and PS5 when the PS5 version launched, which the Series X also benefits from. Otherwise, the only meaningful differences we're going to find are in performance, but given the Xbox platform's system-level low frame rate compensation feature, that could mean that higher resolutions that aren't very viable on PS5 or PS4 Pro might become great options on Series X and Series S. As a heads up for those who may play on both Xbox machines, while your game progress is saved on Square Enix's servers, local data syncs to Microsoft's cloud like any other game. So that can be a minor annoyance when it comes to resolution and HUD scaling preferences, which you may need to adjust for the system that you're currently playing on if you last played the game on the other console. Let's start with playing the Series X version in the exact same way that I've been playing the PlayStation 5 version for the past 3 years, which is using the in-game 1440p setting. This is absolutely the sweet spot for both machines, holding fast to the 60 FPS target in nearly all scenarios. From the most beautiful locations in the Shadowbringers and Endwalker expansions, cities occupied by a normal volume of player activity, and through typical instanced content with human or NPC allies. If any frames do drop in scenarios like these at 1440p on Series X or PS5, it is rare enough and brief enough. As for Series S, well, I was holding on to some hope for solid enough 1440p performance here, but the typical reading at that resolution tends to be in the 40s. So frame rate sensitive Series S players who do not use a VRR display will need to set the game to 1080p to get anything approaching a smooth experience. The good news is that at 1080p, the Series S does typically run at 60 frames per second. Drops in busy areas are still to be expected, but most other blips tend to correct themselves quickly. Using the low detail models on distant object setting tends to eliminate drops on Series S outside of towns, but the cost of visual quality is pretty severe. Obvious geometry swapping and shadow draw-in distracts more than any frame rate deviations in this case, I feel. Enjoy the unimpeded level of detail on Series S while you can though, because for better or worse, it was just confirmed that the low level of detail on distant objects will be enforced on PS4 when the graphics update hits, and that on Series S, low LOD just for shadows will be enforced as well, although whether the draw-in distance will be similar to the current version is impossible to say. Regardless, even when using 1080p on the Series S versus 1440p on the Series X, the junior Xbox's hold on the target frame rate is a bit less firm. Make no mistake though, the Series S's performance at 1080p should still be considered an upgrade over playing the game on PS4 and PS4 Pro hardware. So, during typical play, PS5 and Xbox Series X play identically well at 60 frames per second almost all of the time when set to their sweet spot resolution of 1440p. Series S is probably smooth enough to satisfy most people most of the time at 1080p. But for those expecting more, it is perhaps a less performant version than you might have hoped for. So, what then of the Series X's native 4K mode? Well, I was actually rather surprised to see that the Series X can hit 60 frames per second at 2160p more often than you might think, such as in your typical 4-player instanced content. That is absolutely not to say that it's the norm here, it's just that it is a thing that can happen sometimes. All the same, in the same dungeon, which was released during the era between the third and most recent expansions, I wasn't quite able to push the PS5 all the way to 60 when rendering at 2160p. But elsewhere, those semi-sustained periods of 60 FPS are absolutely not typical for Series X at 2160p. At that resolution, expect frame rates in the mid-40s to low 50s on both PS5 and Series X during the vast majority of play. And while certain situations seem to favor Xbox, sometimes PS5 can lead by a hair too. Make no mistake though, this is a bumpy ride down a gravel frame time road on both systems, the perception of which can only be improved with VRR. And that is exactly what I was most interested to test with the Xbox versions of Final Fantasy XIV. For those unaware, the standard for the variable refresh rate specification is to accommodate frame rates as low as 48 per second. That's what PS5 adheres to, which means that motion can generally look smooth as long as the action remains above that range. In the case of FF14, when set to 2160p on consoles, it's simply too close to 48 FPS too often for standard VRR to get the job done, which means 1440p is inarguably the best way to play on PlayStation 5. Low frame rate compensation, or LFC, can expand the VRR range, but it needs to be implemented on PS5 on a game-by-game basis, whereas it's an automatic Xbox system-level feature whenever VRR is on. If you enable variable refresh rate with your Xbox set to 60Hz, then LFC can help with FF14's 4K mode somewhat, but it can still have a lot of jarring frame times. Ideally, you would set the system output to 2160p at 120Hz. 120Hz moves the lower bounds of the low frame rate compensation considerably and further smooths over frame time variation, resulting in what feels to me like a pretty darn temporally consistent experience. Obviously, it's gonna look juddery on YouTube no matter how I shoot it or record it, but looking at the screen in person, I'm very pleased with the perceived fluidity in FF14's native 2160p mode when using 120Hz VRR on Xbox Series X. Keep in mind though that the frame rate target remains 60 on Xbox at all resolution settings, even when the system is set to 120Hz. The only other way that the native 4K mode could be viable on consoles would be if there were a 30 FPS setting, which is why I've always been puzzled as to why the PC version has a frame rate limiter, but the console versions, where such a feature would probably find a warmer welcome, do not. Because frankly, this is a game that plays just fine at lower frame rates in my opinion, but obviously it's preferable for those frames to be delivered with a smooth cadence. I was genuinely surprised to not see the frame rate limiter carry over from PC to PS4 in 2024, where 60 FPS is rarely achieved, and it remains missing from all console versions 10 years later. So considering all that, 120Hz VRR with LFC on Xbox is the only way to have a mostly smooth gameplay experience in FF14 on consoles while using resolution modes that can't consistently hit 60 FPS. This carries over to the Series S version when set to 1440p as well. It's not likely to hit 60 very often, but I think the bump in clarity going from 1080p to 1440p may be well worth the sacrifice in frame rate when using 120Hz VRR, at least for this game in particular. But naturally, if you do want to play closer to 60 FPS with less noticeable low points, then setting to 1080p while using VRR on Series S should make you happy. And indeed, that's really the only way to really have Series S play smoothly, even at 1080p. Whether using VRR or a fixed refresh rate, certain scenarios can absolutely stress even PS5 and Series X when set to just 1080p, particularly where players have gathered in abnormally large numbers. Unit 645 from the Digital Foundry Supporter Program Discord informed me of the veritable legion of player bodies that perpetually inhabit the Quicksand and Ul'dah on the Balmung server, considered a role-playing server, although seemingly not the kind of role-playing I was expecting. There are far more players here than the engine can display at once, and the wild fluctuations appear to be largely caused by the loading and unloading of characters. As fascinating as this is, it's not like the game should be optimized for an extreme edge case circus of the community's own making. If you're a part of this, then that's on you, not the devs, not your console, not your PC. I think frame rate data from the Limsa Lominsa Aetheryte Plaza is a bit easier to digest in comparisons and is certainly more useful, since this is typically the most crowded mingling place on most servers. No system survives this run unscathed at 1080p, but Series X doesn't fall too far off the mark, although it would be silly to even consider 1080p over 1440p for Series X or PS5 simply because players have overcrowded one spot in the game. In fact, it's interesting that PS5 doesn't perform much worse in this spot at 1440p than it did at 1080p. Naturally, Series S falls even harder at 1440p, but if using 120Hz VRR, even this doesn't look all that bad to my eye. Series X could also be considered alright enough at 4K in the same LFC VRR circumstances here, where both it and PS5 get down into the 30s. Alright, well, let's leave this silliness behind. The last stress tests I want to do are actually pretty practical. Some of the 24-player boss rush style alliance raids from the side story content released after 6.0 can be quite beautiful and quite heavy. I have learned that in scenarios with this many players fighting, and indeed perhaps in general, limiting the visual effects of other players' abilities not only keeps performance much more stable, but also makes the gameplay far more legible. Apologies to the party as I fiddle in the menu here, but if I turn effects for all other players back on for Series X here, not only can you not even see what the heck you're fighting anymore, but 1440p performance takes a sustained tumble deep into the 50s and potentially even lower. Obviously, replicating like-for-like conditions in an MMO with randomly matched players with a different assortment of abilities through different runs on different consoles is not possible to achieve perfectly. But PS5 at 1440p generally hits similar marks to Series X when the full array of overstimulating visuals are on display, although it is generally slightly lower here, and I did plot a few points deeper in the 40s on this run. But seriously, regardless of performance concerns, choosing to limit the alpha transparency visuals on other players' attacks is something I strongly recommend trying for aiding your ability to see and react to the game's many varied and unique boss mechanics, especially in 24-player instances where we see 60 FPS on both PS5 and Series X almost all the time when rendering at 1440p, except when bosses do something especially flashy. Both consoles can briefly drop in these circumstances, although Series X does seem to stand a slightly better chance at getting through unscathed, such as with this wave attack that cost us just a few frames on PS5. In short, no one should feel that their PS5 or Series X is performing considerably better or worse than the other when using the recommended resolution of 1440p to aim for a 60 FPS target, which can be achieved almost all the time, even in big fancy boss fights with 24 players, as long as you limit the other player's visual effects. All of this, however, is a bit much for Series S, even at 1080p and even with limited visual effects settings. But keep in mind that even though the latest content for the current level cap tends to be popular for their gear drops, 24-player events are not the majority of the gameplay. And if you recall, Series S has an imperfect but generally stable enough 1080p frame rate in the more common 4-player instances. Series S can get hit extremely hard in 24-player alliance raids when using 1440p resolution, especially if all visual effects for other players are left on, where the game can be knocked well below 30 FPS and languish between 20 and 30, where you're sure to really feel it, even under LFC VRR conditions. Unsurprisingly, Series X and PS5 also turn in fairly low frame rates during 24-player events when rendering at native 4K. But 120Hz LFC VRR on Xbox can of course help quite a bit here. In addition to the graphics processing optimization, patch 6.2 also added an experimental dynamic resolution setting, which is still marked as a beta feature. Touted as being in preparation for the version 7.0 graphics update, the actual implementation was pretty subpar and remains so. As you'd expect, dynamic resolution scaling, DRS, reduces the 3D rendering resolution from the target you've selected to an intermediary value with the intent of hitting the game's target of 60 frames per second. But in practice, the adjustment occurs far too slowly for the effect to do its job. On PS5 and Series X alike, when the game is set to 4K, expect to see plenty of juddery spots where the resolution is just a bit too high, with the frame times not stabilizing to a consistent 16 milliseconds for a good moment after the damage is already done, as if you've got to wait for the game to finish chewing its pizza before it can push the resolution button. DRS was not yet a widespread gaming feature when A Realm Reborn launched in 2013, but given how it's presented as part of the new upscaling systems in the Dawntrail benchmark and the recent livestream from Square Enix, at least on PC, I'm optimistic that it will be very different from this beta DRS feature. DRS was added to all versions, by the way, even PlayStation 4, but due to bottlenecks in areas other than the GPU, it doesn't significantly move the needle toward a bounty of 60 FPS scenarios, even if it can help it get there from time to time. However, even though the adjustment is slow, Series S players who don't have a VRR display may reap some benefit from the beta DRS, since the system's hold on 60 FPS, even at 1080p, is a bit hit or miss anyway, and it can eventually hone in on 60 FPS in GPU-limited trouble spots. But in the case of PS5 and Series X, since they do have resolution modes that can reliably hit 60 FPS anyway, I think it just makes sense to set those resolutions instead, and avoid DRS for now. One of Square Enix's biggest marketing points when the PlayStation 5 version launched in 2021 was how quickly you could move from zone to zone due to the reduced loading times. And naturally, being equipped with internal solid-state storage, Xbox also loads much faster than the last-gen console versions on PS4 and PS4 Pro. Results can vary and network conditions may play a role, but running from internal storage on PS4, PS5, Series S, and Series X, logging into my instanced in-room takes only about 7 to 8 seconds on the 3 current-gen consoles, first on Xbox by a hair, and about 10 seconds on PS4. More significant differences can emerge when teleporting from zone to zone within the game. In this case, measuring a teleport from fade out to fade in takes roughly 2 or 3 seconds on PS5 and 5 to 7 seconds on the Xbox consoles. A bit slower than PS5 in this example, but all quite reasonable enough given that the wait on PS4 is nearly half a minute. I generally find that taking quote-unquote natural pathways between zones rather than teleports results in faster loads on all consoles. Typically only a second or two on current-gen systems. One little quirk here on Series S though is that when approaching zone lines, there's often some sort of hitch that I even tend to notice with VRR. On closer examination, what reads during 60 FPS capture as only a single duplicate frame with the associated 33 millisecond frame time spike is in fact a duplicate frame, followed by the frame that should have displayed, which is then followed by a temporal jump ahead caused by a skipped frame. So it's actually a series of 4 irregular frames. It's a super minor problem, of course, but I was surprised by how often I notice it. So I kinda don't think that this is technically a loading issue per se, but I've run into unexpectedly long black screens during transitions in a lot of instanced content. Sometimes on Series X, and alarmingly so on Series S. Here I'm on Series S, and my buddy Gatey's Silverant is on PS5. I don't know about the two randos. But I'm stuck on a black screen between segments of the same instance for just over 20 seconds, and when I emerge, everyone else is well along the path, already fighting monsters far away from me. Even worse, when we encountered the boss, I wanted to record the intro cutscene rather than skip it, and the party went on ahead without me, and fair enough, no biggie. But when I emerged from the cutscene, I had to be ushered into the arena due to it being already sealed off by the land path, which resulted in an additional 20-second wait. The boss was already down to 75% HP by then. And even more worse, when I died during the fight, I was stuck in a black void after accepting Gatey's resurrection for another nearly 20 seconds. Normally, the screen goes black and you reappear on the healer's position virtually immediately. I play the absolute lowest stakes job possible, so who cares, I guess. But imagine if this was happening to your party's tank or healer. So this issue matters to everyone, not just Xbox players, and desperately needs to be addressed. Through all this, the game was reporting a strong connection, but just to test things out more, I visited some previously cleared dungeons in Explorer mode, which means I can re-enter with no other players and no monsters. First, a shortcut teleport within the same map has essentially the same length of black screen on PS4, PS5, and Series X, but lasts considerably longer on Series S. Then, crossing over a line to a different map, but still within the same instance, once again is quick enough and about the same on PS4, PS5, and Series X. Series S takes over 10 seconds though, and these comparisons were recorded with a wired internet connection, by the way. Here's a different presentation of a similar intra-dungeon issue. On PS5, this green animation masks the fade from the previous area into white, and then the next area fades in. On Series S, meanwhile, I immediately pop into the next area and can't move for several seconds while I observe other players teleporting in and moving along. Then the transition plays, way late, and I can finally move. It wasn't as bad on my Series X run, but the timing was still just a bit screwed up. The long black screens can happen on Series X too, but not as often as on Series S in my experience. I'm mosaicing some regions of the screen here because of some spoilery text that pops up, but yeah, this is Series X. And then I had to rush through several rooms to catch up to everyone. I'm sure many will say, runs fine on my Xbox, which may well be true. I've had no problems in dungeons on Series S at other times, such as right here. And for all I know, it might not be impossible that things like this could in theory happen on other platforms too, although I've personally never experienced it prior to playing on Xbox, which is why I felt I had to mention it as a potential point of concern. Posts online regarding similarly long instance transitions on Series S and X do seem to corroborate my experience, so I hope that whatever is causing this to sometimes happen and other times not happen can be resolved soon enough. I have to address the overactive profanity filter that targets the chat log, which is the Xbox-specific issue that's gotten the most public attention. No threads I've found online have offered a solution to the problem, so my understanding is that this is a forced feature of the Xbox Online infrastructure no matter your account or system settings, and is independent of the in-game filters, which can be disabled. It doesn't just block out what has been deemed as offensive words, it replaces with question marks any string of forbidden letters within completely normal everyday words and even across adjacent words and sentences. Any given innocuous conversation is sure to cause an issue at some point. Something like,
"Let's do some raids as soon as I'm off work tonight."
"I'd like to level Dark Knight. It's really fun."
It even applies to NPCs and system text like emote descriptions. This has the opposite of the intended effect, because now you have to actively think about the allegedly bad words, maybe even learn some new ones, so that they can serve as your Rosetta Stone for piecing together what anyone's even talking about. I want to believe that this is not working as intended, but it is concerning that the chat issue has remained through the Xbox beta in February and has lasted more than 4 weeks and counting into the release version. It's all so absurd that I have to believe Microsoft and Square Enix are surely already working toward a compromise. I mean, I hope what we're seeing isn't already the compromise, because it's not working. To be honest, I'm worried whether that could be the truth of it, because as far as I've been able to dig up, there's been no acknowledgement of the issue from either company. And if it's something they can fix or are willing to fix, why not say something to salvage the Xbox version's reputation? So I can't help but wonder if policies surrounding in-game text communication is the key to why the Xbox versions took so many years to manifest. You don't have to be super social in Final Fantasy XIV if you don't want to be, but this is not an okay problem to have in an online game with text-based communication, and that currently makes the Xbox versions very hard to recommend to most players, in spite of their many positive points. And with that, I'd say that all that needs to be said about the Xbox versions ahead of the graphics update, or indeed all that needs to be said about any of the console versions at the moment, has been said. There are controversies, of course, but if Xbox is your preferred platform, then it can't hurt to get started with the free trial. I know some might be intimidated about starting at the beginning of a story that doesn't really pick up pace until the first expansion, but honestly, I envy you. Maybe it's just me, but something about those early hours of punching bees, shrews, and sheep and fulfilling mundane tasks at the beginning of a brand new RPG adventure is like gaming comfort food to me. And it gets me excited for the journey to come as I imagine the bigger world out there that I'll soon become powerful enough to explore. As for existing players, you can of course back up your character settings to the server and seamlessly move your hotbar setup to another platform. And it warms my heart seeing the source of my backup, PS5, displayed on my Xbox and vice versa. Getting along and all that, showing how everyone can play together and setting a good example. But I would suggest exercising caution in purchasing the full Xbox version to new and old players alike until we see whether the language filter debacle and dungeon loading bug can be ironed out. I wish that there was a way to have Series S run consistently without VRR, but Xbox's low frame rate compensation does make the highest resolution modes on both Series S and X extremely compelling in a way that has never before been the case in the console versions of Final Fantasy XIV. Like I said, this is one last look at the game as it has been, which I'm happy to have been able to put out there for posterity. But for the soon forthcoming future of the game, what we've seen here today may or may not correlate to what we'll find in the results from the graphics update analysis in a few months' time, which may even determine what platform I'll use for FF14 going forward myself. And that is when I'll see you next. In the meantime, you can find me over at the My Life in Gaming channel, and if you did find this video enjoyable and or useful, you should subscribe and do the bell ringing thing for us over there, as well as here on Digital Foundry, whose Patreon you should also strongly consider supporting so you can join their lovely Discord community, download high quality copies of videos like this one, and of course enjoy early access and exclusive content. But that's all from me for now. See you in Eorzea, and soon in Tyrol.